everyone. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 17th. As you know, Monday was a holiday, so I hope you were able to use your 3-day weekend to start thinking about our final speech, which happens to be the persuasive speech. Probably the most challenging of the three speeches, but the good news is that you've had experience delivering speeches. First with the autobiographical speech, and now second with the informative speech. And the persuasive speech is going to be 15 minutes long rather than 10 minutes long. So you can see that we've increased the time. And you are going to be asked to use outside resources, at least 3. You can use as many as you'd like. I stopped counting after 3, but the minimum is 3. And I was talking about in my last video, for those of you who elected to use outside resources with your informative speech, that there are lots of different ways that you can approach this. You can use your traditional books and magazines. You can certainly use websites, though exercise caution if you are on the open web. I had encouraged you to use the library databases, which are electronic but have been vetted and reviewed so that there is a greater level of validity to those pieces. That said, it's always good to review and examine whatever source you're using. Interviews can work very nicely. The idea is that the interviewee is giving additional value to your speech. So it's not just someone who is going to be a source for you, but someone who can add content. And of course, at the beginning of the semester, we talked about ethics or ethos. So if you're going to be interviewing somebody, you certainly want them to know why you're interviewing them. Make sure that you get their permission for the interview. Make sure it's okay to disclose their name. And if not, you want to provide a pseudonym. And we talked a little bit about the advantages and the disadvantages of primary sources, first-hand accounts, and secondary sources that are based on primary sources, and that basically, ideally, you would use a combination of the two because they both have strengths and weaknesses. But that said, we've got a very short speech, 15 minutes, that is asking you to provide just 3 outside resources. So I'm not going to dictate to you what kinds of resources you should be using. You could use 3 websites if you so wanted to. And as we know, using outside resources, it helps your credibility as a speaker. Because with the persuasive speech, you're talking about a topic that reasonable people could disagree about. So I've always said that the purpose of the persuasive speech is not to have everybody in your audience agree with you. That's an impossibility. I don't even think it's healthy. I think it's good to have diverse opinions. That said, what you do want to earn is your audience's respect so that they can respect your presentation, that obviously you're well prepared and the speech was well delivered. And while they may disagree with your particular position, they can agree that you delivered a good speech. And I usually divide audiences up into 3 groups. We talked a little bit about the ways to examine demographics, and oftentimes politicians will do this when they're trying to evaluate which groups might be likely to vote for them. And there is the group that already supports you. And the hope is that after your speech, they still continue to support you. If they don't, then you've done something wrong. Then the second group is the group that does not agree with your position. And honestly, it doesn't matter what you do or say. They are never going to agree with your position. That's fine. You're looking for the swing vote, if you will, the middle group that could be swayed by your argument. And your argument may not necessarily lead to a change in position immediately. It might just be planting a seed that could take months or even years to develop. But that said, you get to decide how controversial of a topic you are going to choose for your persuasive speech. I certainly encourage you to choose controversial topics. That said, you know that these hot button topics in our society have led to a lot of divisiveness and a lot of anxiety over the years. And I certainly hope that the educational setting is a place where we can talk about these topics, because if we can't talk about them here, we can't talk about them anywhere. So once we start talking about things like gun control and we start talking about things like abortion, again, these are very politically divisive topics. And that's perfectly fine if you wanted to approach that speech from that perspective. If you don't like controversy, you can also choose a topic that's not terribly controversial. And I talk about some topics that have almost no controversy associated with them. For instance, the idea of eating healthy and exercising. Very few people would disagree with that, yet very few people, or many people, I should say, fail to incorporate that into their lifestyle. So this kind of speech is not about you trying to persuade somebody to believe in healthy eating and exercise. This is a speech that's trying to convince people to change their behavior. So think about the counter arguments, the reasons why people might disagree, or in the example I just gave, the reasons why people wouldn't necessarily change their behavior, and try at least briefly to address some of those major elements in your speech rather than doing what I call ignore the elephant in the room, that rather than acknowledging that there are other viewpoints and there are other behaviors, you act as if yours is the only one, which can oftentimes lead to an audience getting rather prickly. We talked about this in a couple of classes ago and also in our last quiz about hostile, or at the very least skeptical, audiences. And sometimes they just want to be acknowledged and heard, and that can do a lot to alleviate some of the skepticism. If you look at the notes below, you'll see that our first section is about dates, because we are quickly coming to an end of the semester. That's both the good and the bad news of the intersession, is how condensed it is. As you know, each one of our daily classes is the equivalent of a week in the academic semester. So today we're talking about, obviously, persuasive speeches, argumentation, and critical thinking. Wednesday, tomorrow, we will have our third quiz. It'll be very similar to the second quiz and the first quiz. 20 questions, multiple choice, some short answers, some true, false, open book, open notes. And I will also give you a sample persuasive speech for you to view from a student in no way affiliated with GCC, so that you can talk about a strength and a weakness from that particular speech. On the 19th, which is Thursday at 11:59 p.m., is when you are going to be asked to post your speech number 3, your persuasive speech. 15 minutes utilizing 3 outside resources. I ask that you list those outside resources on your speaking outline so that I can briefly review them. Again, in the real world, no one would see your outline nor your resources except for you. But again, I wanted to give you my perspective on that. And as you've probably figured out, the outline is essential for the speech. I don't review the speeches unless I've got the speaking outline to also accompany that particular speech. So for those of you who submitted in your speaking outlines, you should have received feedback for speech number 2. So if you have not, please let me know. And those of you who are in perhaps the midst of handing in speaking outlines or handing in an outline late, well then I will get you that feedback as soon as possible once I have the outline and am able to review your speech. So where does that leave us with Friday, which would be quiz number 4? And I dropped the lowest quiz grade. And that means if you've taken the first 3 quizzes and you've done well on those 3 quizzes, you can elect to drop quiz number 4. So that said, if you've missed a quiz along the way, or if it turns out that you haven't performed well on a quiz, then you would definitely want to take quiz number 4. And if you're wondering, though you've probably figured it out, what you would be doing on Friday in addition to your quiz, your attendance question for that class will be for you to view your classmates' speeches. And that will be on Friday the 20th, with you sending 1 strength and 1 weakness to my email. And then that leaves one last class, which is Monday the 23rd. I had left that open in the event we needed it as a catch-up, if there was inclement weather or some sort of an emergency. If all continues the way it's been going this semester, what will happen on that Monday class is that I will just be posting your feedback from speech number 3 and wishing you farewell. And believe it or not, the academic semester will begin next week on Wednesday. So that gives you a short window of time. If you have not registered for classes for next semester, I encourage you to do so. And I might have mentioned a horror film class that I teach. It's not listed under English. It's listed under communications if you're looking for it. And if you're interested in the course, certainly you can ask me for additional information. But you'll also see in section 6 of our notes under registration, I've included a flyer of the class that lists the movies that we would be viewing and discussing over the course of the semester. And again, that's CMN 201. So, going back to the persuasive speech, and that happens to be 15 minutes, 3 outside sources, which I ask that you list on your outline. And do contact me prior to Thursday, the 19th, which is when you will be posting speech number 3, for a practice and consultation. And you know how that goes already, that an email is sufficient by reaching out to me. But certainly if you wanted additional feedback and contact, we could do so over the telephone or via Zoom or some combination thereof. So, motivational appeals. Oftentimes you need to encourage your audience in order to support a particular position. And this is a class in and of itself, motivational appeals, and I just wanted to give you a very brief overview. There are 3 ways that, well, there are many ways, but 3 in particular that work very well to influence behavior. The first is affiliation, and that means belonging. The second is achievement, which is success. The third is power, and that's control. If you're familiar with television advertisements, then you know that these are oftentimes utilized. That, for instance, could be seen in a car commercial, affiliation or belonging, that this is the number one vehicle. And the idea behind that is that you want to be like everybody else. Or achievement or success, that if you're driving a luxury vehicle, that means you've achieved a luxury lifestyle. You can usually see that through the way the person is dressed and perhaps the home in which they live, if the car is parked in front of the home. Or power and control, the idea that one's vehicle is one's environment, so that one may not have power or control in the workplace or at home, but once you're in your car, you can control temperature, you can control things like audio, so forth and so on. So, in addition to those 3, there's one other way to motivate that's incredibly powerful, but I urge you incredible caution if you were to ever use it, and that is fear. Fear works as a terrific motivator, but it interferes with reasoning. The media is quite aware of this, and it will oftentimes use fear to motivate us. And we can see how individuals oftentimes act irrationally because they are motivated by fear. So, that said, fear, again, could have its place for motivation. Again, I think about what your speech topic is and what your end goal is, and the idea of ethos and being ethical. Certainly things like cigarettes or public service announcements will oftentimes use fear to dissuade individuals from smoking. Ironically, even some cigarette companies have been doing this, realizing that even though it's not to their benefit, from a financial standpoint, to lose smokers, it might be their benefit to lose smokers, at least in the short term, because there oftentimes is a high rate of reuse. But to motivate individuals, at least in the short term, not to smoke because of some of the negative effects associated with smoking. And they will oftentimes talk about some of the health difficulties associated with smoking. In other words, they're talking about emphysema, and they're talking about cancer, and they're talking about secondhand smoke. They're using fear to try to motivate you. But I believe that the end goal justifies that this is ultimately for a greater good. But I think about how oftentimes, again, the media utilizes fear just for generating profit. And I think clickbait is a great example. If you've ever seen weather reports online where they're predicting dire forecasts, of course, you click on that and you realize that this is a weather report from the past. So there was really no reason for you to have to look at it, but obviously the way that they structured it, you did click on it, which meant a certain level of profit for that particular organization. Monroe's motivated sequence. Monroe was a theorist who basically talked about a sequence in which you can motivate people. I would suggest that we've been basically talking about this in one way or another all semester long. That first, you need to get your audience's attention, and that's part of the introduction in a speech. Then, for persuasive speech, you need to establish that there's some sort of a need, something that needs to be rectified, and that your idea or proposition will in one way or another satisfy that need or help to alleviate some of that need. Visualization. What would life be like if you did satisfy that need and if you didn't satisfy that need? And then if there's a call to action, so if you want your audience to do something, donate money, sign a petition, so forth and so on. And I'm of two minds as to which might be more difficult. Sometimes it's more difficult to motivate an audience to take action, much like in the example I gave previously about exercising and eating well. Other times, it's not that difficult. Perhaps you can get somebody to sign a petition, even if they don't necessarily agree with the position, because it could be in their benefit to be seen signing the petition. It's a PR move or a petition. It could be a PR move, or perhaps they just want you to leave, so this is their way to get you to leave. And again, belief systems, sometimes it's very difficult to change people's belief systems, and sometimes it's easier to change people's belief systems. It just depends. What you need to do is to present an argument. This is language we oftentimes use in English classes. An argument doesn't necessarily mean a fight. It's when you give a claim, and basically you're taking a position on something. And the way you're doing it is by providing evidence and some kind of reasoning pattern. There are lots of different claims or positions you can take. You can take a claim of fact, but even a claim of fact can be debatable. For instance, GCC is a small school. That is a fact. But in comparison to what? It could be viewed as a very large school in comparison to other schools. Or claim of value, that something is good or bad, and that oftentimes is quite subjective. GCC is a good school, let's say. How do you measure something like that? Is it test scores? Is it graduation rates? There are lots of different ways to go about doing that. Or a claim of policy, the belief that an action should be taken. Again, I'll use GCC as an example. GCC should reestablish a sports program. And actually, we once did have a sports program. Finances were the reasons why it was eliminated initially. We could talk about the pros and cons associated with that decision and whether or not that decision actually saved money or perhaps cost the institution tuition dollars from students who elected not to attend GCC for another school that had a sports program. So what we try to do is use reasoning techniques in order to make our decisions. You can use inductive reasoning, in other words, examples. And think about how medical studies work. The idea is that if you could duplicate the results in many medical studies, then that leads to a certain level of validity. And then you can deduce, this is deductive reasoning, or make a generalization from all of those inductive reasoning examples, those medical studies. So you can deduce that all of those medical studies would show that this particular medication is effective. But again, we've seen many medical studies where that has proven to be incorrect. And then if you're reasoning from sign, when you are actually taking the medication, and then we could see how the medicine actually interacts in the real life with users. The example I gave for deductive reasoning in the notes below is the generalization that it has a good amount of truth associated with it, and is the reason why I suspect you're taking an intercession class. College leads to success, and there is truth to that, but not always. So there are successful people who didn't go to college, and then there are people who went to college who do not become successful. The reasoning from sign, the example I gave you, a sign is an observable mark. If you experience a sore throat, for instance, that might be a sign that you're getting a head cold. In other words, you've induced through all of the times this has happened to you that through deductive reasoning, you've made a generalization that when you have a sore throat, that means you ultimately are going to get a head cold. So that's the sign that leads you to that place. That said, there are many ways to make errors in reasoning. We do all of the time. And the idea is that you want to try to reduce the errors in reasoning when you're presenting information, whether it be in written and verbal form. And you also want to be as the consumer imperative, which we talked about at the beginning of the semester. As a consumer of speeches and information, you want to be on the alert to listen for errors in reasoning. This, too, is a class in and of itself. I'm just going to give you a few of the errors in reasoning. Hasty generalization. So there's too little evidence, and then you make a generalization. And I always talk about this at this time of the year where the new semester is beginning, and the college needs to make decisions about which classes to keep open and which classes to close based on student enrollments. Now, of course, those decisions are occurring before the beginning of the academic semester, so you could easily argue that with more time, classes that don't fill could fill, but again, that's a risk. So what you're trying to do is use the evidence that occurs, and hopefully you're not making a hasty generalization in terms of closing a class. And there could be an assumption that because a class hasn't run before, therefore this class is not popular or needed. But there could be lots of other factors. It could be the time in which the class is being offered. It could be the teacher who's teaching the class. So again, there are usually multiple elements associated with a truth. The appeal to ignorance, that you want to prove me wrong, what you don't know. So basically the idea is with the appeal to ignorance is that I'm right until you can prove that I'm not right. I can say I'm a space alien until you can prove that I'm not. You can see the problem with that. The burden of responsibility has been placed on other rather than yourself in order to support an argument. The bandwagon fallacy, that everybody wants to join the crowd, joining the bandwagon, so to speak. I call it the teenage fallacy, where oftentimes teenagers will say things like, well, everybody else is allowed to go to the party. Why can't I go to the party? I should be allowed to go to the party too. The sequential fallacy, that cause and effect are connected to one another. And that isn't always so clear cut. So you might do poorly on a quiz and say that the cause of that was because you had a cold. However, it could be that you always perform poorly on quizzes. That means the cold is irrelevant, even though the cold came before the results of the quiz. So you need to be careful that you can separate out cause and effect. Begging the question, rephrasing the question, circular reasoning. And I see this all of the time. For instance, something like, what is critical thinking? It's thinking critically. So basically, you've just rephrased the question. You haven't defined what critical thinking is. This was actually from a quiz. Or what is empathic listening? And it's listening with empathy. Again, you haven't defined what empathy is. So the appeal to authority sounds like it would not be an error in reasoning, but in this instance, it's using some sort of celebrity endorsement for something that that celebrity doesn't really have expertise in. Television commercials will oftentimes do this as well, with sports stars and with actors promoting products that have nothing to do with their area of expertise. So again, the hope is that if you admire this particular person, you will want to emulate them and purchase that product, but they don't really have any knowledge or expertise that's above the average person about that product. Name calling. This one is pretty obvious that you are attacking the individual. It's what I call the schoolyard um, argument. Genetic fallacy, the idea that the truth is in the origins, or just because something has always been done a particular way, it should continue to be done in a particular way. I see this oftentimes used in the workplace. We did this way in the past, so therefore we should always do it this way, or why aren't we doing it this way? Now, I think that from an intellectual error, just sort of going through these errors of reasoning, they make perfect sense. But the reality is that we are more than just intellectual beings, we are also emotional beings. And in the heat of the moment, it becomes very easy to no longer think with intellect, but to think with emotion. And I think the best example that I can give you of this is something that actually happened. And you can see in the notes below under the fourth section, Errors in Reasoning, that there's an article from Diverse Education that I wanted you to read that talks a little bit, it's a short article, that talks a little bit about an incident that occurred several years ago, and it was with two university debate teams. If you know anything about debate, basically these are teams that compete against one another. They're supposed to put forth arguments supporting controversial topics. And then there's a panel of judges, usually made up of professors from both institutions, that determine a winner and a loser. Okay. And things went badly at a particular debate, and you're probably assuming that the students lost control. It wasn't the students, it was the two debate coaches from the two universities that were competing with one another. There's a lot of background story to this. These were two debate coaches that had debated previously. There was some ill will between them. One of the debate coaches happened to be a Caucasian male. The other debate coach happened to be a black female. The topic of the debate in which they lost their tempers, it was a very controversial topic about race. And it had something to do with the scoring system. Now, you can strike out an opponent, meaning that you could give them a negative score. It isn't literally hitting somebody when you say strike. Okay, so this is the background. So what ended up happening? What ended up happening is that both of the debate coaches started screaming profanities and obscenities at one another. And one of them actually mooned the other, or at least attempted to, and this was the male coach. He lowered his pants and showed his backside, but he was still wearing underwear. So I guess you could debate whether or not that's true mooning. All right, so this happened to be recorded. This was in the early days of phone technology, but nevertheless, always be careful when it comes to the internet and posting, because not only was this recorded, it was posted on the internet, even though it wasn't supposed to be. And it went viral. And the result was that one of the debate coaches, the male, was fired. He was the one who engaged in the mooning. And the other debate coach, the female, she was put on probation. And of course, we can debate back and forth whether or not that was an appropriate, quote, punishment, unquote, for their behavior. That's not what I'm really interested in, nor am I really interested in what they were arguing about. What I'm interested in is that two seasoned professionals who knew better could descend to that level. And this shows how easy it is to lose control of one's emotions. Now, this video was pulled by the debate coaches. The thing is that every time they try to pull it, it appears again. And I've been able to find it. So as the post, at least as of the moment of my posting this video, if you go to the link below, you'll see there is a YouTube link which shows just a couple of minutes of their argument, but I think you can get a sense of how heated it became. It ended up resulting actually in a student bursting into tears. It was really a horrific thing. And again, I show this to illustrate how easy it is to commit errors in reasoning and to lose one's ability to maintain calm in the light of controversial issues. And That said, I think we've seen plenty of examples in Washington, D.C. I've oftentimes said that I wish they could conduct themselves the way my public speaking students conduct themselves, because I see a level of honor and I see a level of intellect with my students that I unfortunately am seeing less and less of amongst our politicians. And I've always said that we should hold these individuals accountable, that if we ourselves are expected to maintain a certain level of professionalism and ethos or ethics, they should as well. Now, that said, after you've watched that brief video, which is just a couple minutes long, and you've read the article, what's left is your attendance question for today. And you've probably already figured out what your attendance question is today. And I had indicated that in yesterday's notes. If any of you wanted to start early, that I'm going to ask you to watch all of the posted speeches from your classmates for speech number 2, the informative speech that's in the top folder in Moodle. And to send me via email, so this is done privately, one strength and one weakness of each of your classmates' speeches. What I will do is compile all of that information, much like I did with speech 1, and post that for our next class so that you can see that. And hopefully that feedback from your peers, as well as my feedback, will help you develop your public speaking skills. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye.